But first, earlier today, our time, the former US Commander-in-Chief Donald Trump was all over the airwaves with his first big speech since leaving office. His hour-and-a-half address to the Conservative Activist Conference, score settling aside, essentially made 2 points. One, that he was not going to start a new political party because there was already a perfectly good centre-right party, the Republican Party, that united, he reckons, could go on to even greater success than ever before. And two, that he could be a presidential candidate again in 2024. Naturally enough, he was cheered to the echo by the activists he's largely mobilised and generally enthused over the past 4+ years. My reaction, though, to his speech was perhaps a bit different than the room. To start with, for me, the party's always been bigger than the individual. I know that's not Trump's way, but it's the only way a party sustains itself, meaning it's time for Conservatives around the world to look beyond Trump. As much as his time in office shook up a system that badly needed shaking up, it's time to look beyond him. One of the reasons why President Trump so fascinated activists on the right was because he's been so utterly impervious to the leftist taunts that have cowed so many more orthodox centre-right leaders. He's been the total antithesis of political correctness. I get that. But Trump has been seized upon and elevated by a leftist commentariat, a bit like Pauline Hanson was here, because they want to tar all Conservatives with the Trump brush as people who would trash democracy, so it gets, when they don't get their own way. Now, to the Green left, every Conservative is basically a racist reactionary who puts profit before people. And by making the recent presidential election all about him, rather than what he'd done for the American people and would continue to do for them, well, Trump fed that unhelpful stereotype. The last thing the centre-right should be doing for the next 4 years is to eulogise Trump rather than finding and championing a successor. What's needed across the English-speaking world is for broadly conservative people to be working out how best, to use Scott Morrison's phrase, we keep our economies strong, our countries safe and sovereign, and our peoples together with a special place for the family. We know that the Green left's climate and identity obsessions are utterly ruinous. So we need to call out the absurdity of fixating over emissions from Western countries, but not from China, and the unreality of denying human biology, but without surrendering our credentials as conservationists or as people who respect others in all of our differences. Let's face it, there's no reason why Trump couldn't have achieved all he did in terms of cutting taxes and red tape, pulling out of the Paris Agreement, moving the embassy to Jerusalem, boosting the military, taking on China, increasing real wages and jobs, especially for women and minorities, and largely building the wall without the nasty late-night tweets and the gratuitous insults, the nepotism, and the sacking of nearly all the adults in his administration. Especially with a more fragmented and polarised polity than ever before, there's no point enthusing 30% of voters if at the same time you so alienate 50% as to make yourself unelectable. Successful politicians need to know when to build bridges as well as when to emphasise difference. Trump understood that in politics, you've got to be prepared to make enemies. But what I think he never really grasped is that in making enemies, you should never make more enemies than you absolutely have to. So the task for the centre-right in the United States and elsewhere, like here in Australia, at least for the next 3 years, is not to be Trump groupies, but to keep the people he mobilised, those that the political establishment had taken for granted, to keep them on their side and voting for Conservative parties. And it won't mean, of course, surrendering to the left on climate, identity or modern monetary policy. It won't mean accepting the left's critique of our history and culture. But what it will mean is standing up to the left much more successfully than Trump did, who in the end lost to one of the weakest presidential candidates in Joe Biden in history. Now, I know Trump was up against it, with the media that barely gave him a go, and unlike so many of the modern political class from the right, well, he was absolutely fearless in speaking his mind, whether you agreed with him or not, and there was a lot I disagreed with. That in itself, that fearlessness, is a trait we need more of in politics than less. But at its best, politics is a profession, and democracy thrives when good and decent and capable people stand for office and win. I've always said the candidate who is desperate for the job is not the one you want. It's the candidate who has to be talked into running that's usually there for all the right reasons. So by all means, let's fight the good fight. Let's do it with champions who are no less smart than President Trump and no less brave to take on the swamp or the system. But if we're going to keep them in office and keep them there, let's have candidates that are perhaps a little less flawed.